And welcome everyone to our next presentation for the National Social Sciences Week for 2021. It's an online presentation being done this evening by an eclectic bunch of people, and you'll meet us very shortly, coming from a couple of different places in southern New South Wales. And this evening's topic is from the horse's mouths, the past, present and future of collaboration for investigating our region's national resources. Now, this is a really interesting topic because it brings that mix together of sciences and social sciences, the people, the community, with the sciences. And I think we have seen a lot of that in the past couple of years with COVID. And we hope to show you this evening how this might also show up in something like natural resource management, which is so dear to our hearts in regional Australia. So, greetings to everyone. We are going to make a start firstly with an acknowledgement of country, and we'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri and Ngari people who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands from where we are speaking to you from this evening, and pay our respects to their elders both past and present, and any emerging leaders that may be with us tonight. I'm speaking to you from the far south of Wiradjuri country this evening in Albury, and I'm looking at a spectacular evening and sunset, which hopefully is not blinding you because it would be showing straight over my shoulder, but hopefully you won't be blinded by that this evening, but it's a sparkling evening here. I'm going to do a little introduction of what we're going to be talking about this evening, and that includes introducing our two other presenters who are with us tonight, Louise Burge and Shelley Scholar, and they are going to be giving us a lot of what we are really talking about with our, what we see as the future of natural resource management, and particularly the research that goes into natural resource management. Now, just quickly before we go on to those introductions, we're going to be talking about how social sciences works in regional communities. And one thing we really believe in is that social science research can really give regional communities a voice. In recent years, farmers and regional communities, landholders, don't just want to be engaged in natural resource management, they want to be part of it. They want to be part of the evidence of natural resource management and what goes into conserving biodiversity, particularly in places such as inland southern Australia, which is really facing some major challenges and wicked problems. We've done this particularly using what we call an action research case study, so where we're actually working at the same time in addressing natural resource management issues. And so our social research is actually being woven into some of this natural resource management research. It's based around Deniliquin in the New South Wales Murray Valley, just north of the Murray, and the people that we've been working with in this social research, some of them are here tonight, and it's in the light of wanting to be able to give voice to people who are involved in natural resource management is so much part of the whole social research scene. So the three speakers who are here are going to look at past research projects and their impacts on landholders. We're going to be looking at current research about the collaboration between landholders and researchers, and then we'll be looking at the future of this collaboration, what it might look like, and how landholders and researchers might work better together as we address natural resource management issues. We've got, as I said, three speakers. Firstly, we'll have Louise Birch, who is the current chair of the National Agricultural Production and Reconciliation Ecology Centre, henceforth known as NAPREC. I'm not going to say that every time. And she's based in Deniliquin, actually south of Denny today, next to Tupple Creek. And she may have a couple of words to say about the creek as well when she gets on. She's a rice farmer and sheep grazier from that way. There's myself. I'll be giving the second part of the presentation, particularly around the current, what we're doing now with this group. And then Shelley Scholar will be speaking, and she's currently with Nutrisoils based in Albury. And she's the former secretary of NAPREC. And she's formerly also a rice farmer from near Deniliquin as well, and how we all met up in the first place. So I'm going to hand over to Louise to introduce our topic tonight and our area and talk a little bit about this collaboration that we've been doing. And then I'll come back later. So over to you, Louise.
Thank you very much, Wes. Yes, it's been an interesting project and process of different people coming together across tables and developing these relationships that previously didn't exist to the extent in our valley. As a little bit of a background to myself, I've been involved in catchment management. I've been involved in fencing incentive programs, represented farmers at state and federal level through New South Wales Farmers Association, and also been involved in many other localised representative groups. And it's been an interesting journey, particularly representing farmers at state level, looking at areas of policy and also both the negatives and positives. And what I see as a missing link in a lot of natural resource management programs, and that is the human factor. How do we engage the human factor, and how do we make that last a long time and develop with the opportunities around such a relationship? So I'd like to, as a bit of a weird sort of introduction, I'd like to just test a scenario. Imagine Australia's population now being roughly 25 million people, and governments wanted to mandate that 10% of the population had to give up one or two of their bedrooms to provide additional social housing, because basically the government wasn't able to provide that themselves. Now, the government would choose that 10% of these people of the population would be involved, and they would design the program and would determine how you would adjust, that family would adjust their life to losing one bedroom. It's not a voluntary program, and it's not a compensable program in the way that you and I would basically think of. And the rest of the population, of course, is not required to participate in the program. So what would the social response to that be? And probably for those unaffected, they would think it's possibly quite a feasible scheme. But those who are affected quite possibly would face social, economic and family upheaval, and definitely a loss of trust in government processes. Now, while this might seem a little bit of a ridiculous example, it's the loss of trust that I've seen in many, many parts of NRM policy. And we often, as Australia, we've gone down a pathway, but we've only looked or concentrated on a couple of design mechanisms in that pathway. And I think that we really need to start looking outside the box. And is there a better way to do business? I think when I look at the history, I think one of the best opportunities is co-design and engaging people at the very outset, at the very first foundation stone. So I'd like to possibly raise the example of say, threatened species. Now, how do you engage, maintain interest and continued relationships in protecting and enhancing threatened species? Now, our current system of government processes has a high reliance on listing threatened species, and the more species that are on the list, there's an assumption that there's going to be, you know, higher outcomes on ground. And often the process is through regulation with a bit of incentive thrown in here and there. But what would happen if Australia went down the pathway of, as a primary mechanism, avoidance of species getting on the list in the first place, and a mechanism for trying to focus on getting species off the list? And that way, I think if we took that focus, it helps us move towards sort of more sustainable outcomes. And how could things be done differently? And I think in the design of programs and policy, the foundation principle should be how to build trust and long-term lasting relationships. So I'll give you an example, one, which I won't go into private names, but I'll talk about the Plains Wanderer example, which was, it's a ground-dwelling bird in the Southern Riverina region. Now, originally, there was some enthusiastic landholders, and one in particular with very, very high local knowledge, and that person conducted his own surveys and welcomed bird tour groups, etc., etc. Subsequent to that too, was the local shire had to develop, as part of vegetation plans, developing mapping for remnant vegetation. And information obtained through that work and previous visitations, etc., unfortunately led to, well, fortunately or unfortunately, but it led to Australia's sort of, and New South Wales's reliance on regulation to achieve outcomes. So consequently, the Plains Wanderer was listed as a vulnerable species on the threatened species list. And as part of that process of listing, then you develop a recovery plan, and that program or that planning process, you know, had a committee, advisory committee, etc., etc. But the process wasn't successful. And over a 20-year period, it was accompanied by conflict, failure to meet deadlines of the recovery plan itself. And the legacy issue became one of mistrust in government processes, mistrust in identifying species on private land, etc. And really, it was like a flag up a flagpole for many other farmers. Ooh, we best not disclose what's on our private properties. Now, in contrast, at the end of that roughly 20-year cycle, lessons have been learnt, and it's a really positive step forward. And now there's a fresh focus on an incentive-based mechanisms, but one, it's a partnership between governments and farmers where it's a voluntary participation, and it's also landholders are very much in the co-design seat to helping determine what they would need to set aside land, etc. So that has been a journey of challenges, and at the end of that journey, unfortunately, such a long journey, we're now in a period where it's a more positive steps going forward. In the same, a sort of little bit further down in the Riverina, there's an example, and I will name this family, the Hermiston family. Now, originally, this family had quite a very strong enthusiasm for biodiversity, and they originally started some farming forestry plots. And they developed some monitoring with the CSIRO at the time, and that was a good relationship. But the family's interest in biodiversity was extensive, and they progressed to fencing off remnant vegetation, building biodiversity values on their farm. And it's quite an amazing farm to see just what the workload over multiple generations has achieved. And one of the good things also is that as part of the development of their biodiversity strategy for their farm, they have a long-term research program with Dr. Damien Michael, who's Senior Research Officer at ANU with the Fenner School of Environment and Society. And that research has been going over 15 years. Now, the knowledge and documented outcomes of these sites is quite incredible. And that is not typical of predominantly government programs where they come and go and you don't get that long-term monitoring values. But it is a remarkable relationship, one based on trust and respect and mutual appreciation of the outcomes derived from both the farmer's investment in the land and the research being conducted on a long-term basis. The other positive example in our region was the Murray Land and Water Management Plans, which came about from 1980, risks of dryland salinity and risks of rising water table in irrigation areas. And the Land and Water Management Plans were a scheme designed, and it was a partnership between farmers, community, governments, science, and Murray Irrigation as a delivery agent of the actual programs. But it was a co-designed program. And the solutions were developed over a 5-year period, but implemented over a much longer phase. And significant investments were done by both the private sector and government. And the outcomes was that the issue of rising water table was managed, and the biodiversity benefits that were added on to that program have been quite extensive. So I think there are many good examples, and Landcare's one, and there is a number of programs that many people have been engaged in, which really have been remarkable in their achievements. But if we look more broadly at, for example, New South Wales or other parts of Australia, for every good news story, there are some challenging stories. And I believe that part of that is that our reliance by governments on policy and policy design that hasn't valued the human factor, I think has been detrimental in actually achieving long-term sustainable outcomes for biodiversity in many parts of the rural landscapes. So a number of us have seen that. I've certainly seen it in my life's involvement in natural resource management policy, whether it be through catchment management, whether it be through fencing programs, whether it be as a farmer representative right across New South Wales. And it's led to, I suppose, the development of a concept by stakeholder groups in our region to establish the Murray Valley as the centre for agricultural productivity and the term reconciliation ecology. Now, reconciliation ecology in is a international term developed by Dr. Michael Rosenwig, and we have built an element of methodology developed on the basis of Dr. Michael Rosenwig's book, Win-Win Ecology. And it's basically to develop pathways to productivity and reconciliation ecology about relationships, opportunities between universities, peoples, farmers and government, and building opportunities both on the public and private land. Because as we know, species move between public and private land, and unfortunately, a lot of research is done on available land access, often in the public sector, but privately, there's a huge untapped wealth of information. The problem is, how do you build relationships for that to actually be accessed, and to, importantly, develop those long-term monitoring relationships that we've seen with the example that I raised earlier with the Hermiston family and Dr. Damien Michael. So I think we are really at the point of looking at what works. How can Australia do better? How can governments do better? And what are the unique foundation platforms for that human relationship between universities and researchers and governments and farmers? And I think for too long we have undervalued the human side in policy development and co-design, because we know it can work, and we know what does work and what doesn't work. And there is an incredible opportunity going forward, but we do need to learn the lessons of the past. And so, Wes, I think there's been plenty of information exchanges already in relation to our discussions between NAPREC and Charles Sturt University and the Institute of Land and Water and others. So it's been a very interesting journey, and I look forward to the continuation of it.
Okay, thanks, Louise. And that is a fantastic introduction to what we're speaking about this evening in terms of social research. And just before we go, I might also, before we move on to what's happening now, and particularly with NAPREC, I might just make a correction on something I mentioned earlier, and that we are, and Louise has just been speaking from Wamba Parapa land, where she is there. My mistake, I made a mistake early on. I apologise sincerely, please. So I'd like to go on with the what we're and how we're working with Louise and the whole NAPREC group in recent years, and just sort of outline some of the things that we've already found, and some things that a couple of things we're hoping to do, which will then hopefully lead on to Shelley. So in the last few years, particularly since 2017, which is round about when I came on board with this, is we set up a set of collaborators that were going to work with groups such as NAPREC in around the Deniliquin area, but also a little bit broader than that as well. And we're a group of ecologists and social researchers with the Charles Sturt University Institute for Land, Water and Society, mainly based in Albury, but a number of us also in northeastern Victoria, and with a group of farmers based around Naprek in the southern New South Wales. But also associated with this, and we see this really important, and it's going to become more important now as we look to widen our relationships, is associated people who we've already met a couple of times at least at various fora. And you can see there that I've got a list down there. They are they take over a broad range of the community. And this is really important in the research that we're looking at, is we're looking at local government, we're looking at Indigenous groups, we're looking at private enterprise, we're looking at broader government groups such as, not so much MDBA, but the MDB Local Government Association, the local government association in the Edwards River Council, and also non-government groups such as land care groups. We're all gradually starting to get that conversation going. We have been in conversation, and so importantly, what we're looking at as in this conversation and for the basis of collaboration is forming, as Louise has already been describing, forming those trusting and importantly respectful relationships that last over both time and distance, because we are over distance from here. We have to be able to work a few hours away, for example, from the Deniliquin region, the Mid-Murray region. And so we've been doing this through a set of formal face-to-face and informal meetings, some of them very informal. We've been looking at also how we develop our communication. But I think really importantly is different worlds, whether they be academic, farmers, agency groups. We are looking at how we can build empathy in those different worlds. So how have we, and also you'll notice with that, it's multi-community. So we're looking at lots of different communities being involved here. It's multidisciplinary, which means, we're bringing together farmers who bring in a great lot of practical knowledge and local knowledge. We're looking at Indigenous groups in the same way. And indeed also business coming in. We've got ecologists who are trained, professional ecologists with CSU, and also private ecologists too, as well as social researchers based in Charles Sturt University's Institute for Land, Water and Society. Now, in our lead up to this, we've already completed some initial research, and this was research I completed with Mike van der Zee, another social researcher, and we worked together with the Northeast Catchment Management Authority based in northeastern Victoria, mainly just to get some background about what are the barriers that this particular group sees in working with researchers such as are found at Institute for Land, Water and Society. And so we worked on a very detailed set of interviews with researchers from ILWS and agency people from Northeast CMA, and we came up with 5 groups of very common, amazingly common issues that affected communication between these two groups. That was a lack of commonality and particularly sometimes empathy for how the different groups work together and how they worked in their day-to-day. Poor communication. Sometimes it wasn't the fact there wasn't online communication or social media or anything like that. It's just sometimes we didn't even use the same online communication. Competition and tensions. This particularly occurred where there was competition for funding for research projects, where in some cases, universities and agencies were actually competing for the same pot of money. And this led to competition and tensions, which broke down communication between these groups. There was also external drivers, such as time pressures from trying to get a hold of money or people or resources, or sometimes not even knowing what was in those groups. And sometimes it was personal attributes. Sometimes people just didn't plain get on. This might all seem fairly common sense, but it was really interesting how no one had really sort of put it together about how these different things came together to actually cause quite big barriers between agencies. What we looked at was also how we might overcome some of these, such as by developing more collaborative organisational cultures, which we found wasn't always present in an organisation. How you could allow and support time. Time was a really big problem here. Sometimes it wasn't money, it was actually allowing enough time for relationships to build and recognising that time was required. And sometimes organisation and funding bodies didn't actually allow for that time. They didn't allow for resources to be able to be put aside to help build that time together. And this helped the third point there of shared and ongoing understanding. So making sure that people had enough time together, different groups had enough time together to be able to build that understanding of what was happening in their worlds. From that then, being able to build more common goals and objectives, and building on from what Louise has talked about in being able to help co-design. Groups come together to be able to design projects together. And then going a step further is actually building a joint research strategy, programs that come together and bring groups together so that they come out with joint objectives and joint ways of implementing and building projects. And we've found that many of these things I've just talked about actually occur with farming groups as well. So how we've done that is since, as I said, 2017, we've been involved with a number of initial, about 3 now, I think, initial planning meetings, as well as smaller group meetings. We've been involved with some relevant joint social research that I've been carrying out, and a couple of other people have been carrying out since then. We've also been developing a joint paper, and we'll explain why we've done that in a sec, involving both academics and farmers as authors, which has been a fabulous exercise. We are up to the stage now of looking at joint research projects, and indeed looking at even forming a more formal collaborative group that will look to building research that addresses both the needs of both groups and the understandings of both groups. So just as I'll point out, we will be making this presentation available towards the end of this presentation, and these links here are actually links off to go and have a look at papers that we've already produced as part of our research. So there's a bit of information for you, the viewer, as well. We've also done that ILWS NECMA report, which I've just described. That is a link there off to that. And since that, we've also done some interviews with NAPREC members to try and look and see if what we found with the ILWS and NECMA report also occurred with the farmers. And indeed, we have found many, many similarities between those groups in what are the barriers and what could be also used to overcome them. Now, I've talked about we've got this joint paper between academics and farmers. This is part of our aim to try and understand each other's worldviews. And so the farmers have been on the journey of going down publishing, the academic publishing track with us researchers as well. And I think Louise and Shelley might agree that it's been quite an interesting process over quite a while. I think it's nearly 2 years now. We hope we're getting towards the end of that process now. But I think both of them will agree that it's been quite an interesting process and sort of stepping into the shoes as academics as well and seeing what that's like and seeing the sorts of issues that we have to deal with in the academic world when we're looking at publishing. It's been very interesting. We're also looking at, as I say, looking at these joint projects and forming a collaborative group. One of the problems with that, of course, has been the pandemic. We've not been able to meet as often as what we'd hoped. We're hoping that as the pandemic, we go through the process of the pandemic, that we will be able to meet soon. Here's fingers crossed, and we'll be able to reactivate some of the projects or look at what we can do in the future for building these joint projects. So here's where we're up to now. We're up to starting to build these projects. We've got with us this evening also Shelley Scholar. She is as I've already described, she's also been involved with NAPREC, and I'm going to hand over to her now with what we've been talking about and where we would like to go with our research collaboration, and perhaps also a little bit about how our social research is helping. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow Shelley to share hers.
Yep. Okay. Thanks very much, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I think my screen is wanting to share.
Here we go.
Here we go. Okay, now we're right. Okay. I guess I just briefly had grown up on a farm. I went away to university, did a science degree, and then ended up back on the farm. And things had changed quite a bit, because when I left, the community was very vibrant. Farmers worked collaboratively together and took on projects. My dad in particular, and all the farmers around us, you know, planted trees, did all the right things, and, you know, contributed positively to biodiversity. I think I was pretty unique with my parents, would share their experiences, and we always had people from the city, particularly engineering students from Box Hill TAFE would come and stay on farm, and there was always that interlinking of, you know, sharing experiences. When I came back in, and it was in the middle of the millennium drought, so I left in mid-90s, came back in 2006, and it had changed, and there was this us versus them attitude that had developed, and, you know, where I left, where there was that collaboration, had disappeared, and that was really sad to see that farmers felt like the bad guys. And when, you know, they were, from my perspective, everyone was, you know, contributing to outcomes for the environment as well as food production. So that was a very confronting thing to find myself in. And that's, you know, Louise and I began the process of NAPREC. When Wes asked me to speak tonight about the future of research collaboration, he asked me, what do I think that means? And I think it means that Australia should be world leaders in collaborative research, because that's the best hope for our country, not for just the country, but for the whole world. Coming across reconciliation ecology, which means that we can have food production and ecological outcomes on the same space. I think that is the future, because we will not be able to feed a growing population and protect the biodiversity needs without a shift and working together to achieve that. So to do that, we need to work together. Farmers are now off sharing my screen. Where's I can't? Oh, there we go. Farmers are the most observant people, except me. I was not the best farmer, but I was very passionate. But my dad was the best observer. He would notice that if I made any mistakes, he would have observed them. Farmers, we need to tap into their ability to problem solve and to be excellent observers, and we need to marry that with the detailed knowledge that our academics have. And I think bringing those things together, we can achieve the most amazing things. We can ensure that we have ecological outcomes, but we can meet the food and fibre needs, that should have said food and fibre needs for the world, and we can have a sustainable future. At the moment, there's still, I feel, this us and them, and NAPREC has made definitely significant steps in overcoming that, and we have such a great relationship with the academics that we have worked with, and that gives me hope. In particular, I know it gives Louise hope as well of what we can do moving forward. If I think academia and research is key to proving that we can have long-term sustainable outcomes on human-dominated spaces. The skill sets of academia in collecting evidence is just so crucial to supporting the farmers in the collation of that evidence, and their skill set in educating others is what's lacking on the farmers' side. So if we can marry these two things together, these two worlds together, farming and academia, and I must say, I've neglected to add into our First Nations people, because we need to bring them in for this journey as well. They have such an intimate knowledge of the land, and we're not utilising that as well. And if we can marry this all together, then we have the opportunity to influence public opinion and start spreading hope, because if we can get other people to see that by working together, we all do want the same outcomes. I truly believe that, but there's different views on how they are achieved. So if we can start influencing public opinion on that we can do this together, I think that can spread a new hope and take away some of the us versus them that has been felt. So how can we do this? In my vision, which, you know, is a vision of NAPREC, it's got to be community driven, and like Louise pointed out, it's got to have co-design. I do not think that we can have long-term sustainable outcomes for anyone, whether that's for First Nation people, whether it's for social, economic or environmental, unless we have communities owning the process and owning the outcomes if communities own that process, they are going to have so much pride in the outcomes, and that's just going to build that momentum in working together. I think we really need to utilise existing infrastructure that is in our local communities and have hubs. For example, if Deniliquin had a hub for research and collecting evidence, and we can utilise the existing infrastructure that's already there. We've got a fantastic TAFE that has all the technology available to it. If we utilised that kind of thing, that overcomes some of the hurdles of, distance. And as I've already pointed out, we need the support from academia and research to pull all the evidence together and develop a new pathway forward. Yeah, I think I'm probably going over the same ground again, but if we can utilise those connected and lived experiences with the, whether it's PhD students or, the word just jumped out of my head. Honours students and things like that. We can have both academia and the lived experiences identifying problems together, co-designing projects and co-designing solutions together. And I think that when that happens, everyone owns the project. They own the evidence, they own the education, and they can all be proud of it and have some really good outcomes. And then in turn creates long-term relationships. And I've been very fortunate in my time to witness some really great win outcomes. Every year that we grew rice, we had bitterns. The Australasian bittern is an endangered species, and it bred in the rice crops that we had. So that's very lucky for me to see that win outcomes can happen. So I guess from my perspective, I have a belief that we can do this, that we can have these win-win outcomes and change people's perception. Perception about farmers being the enemy, and we can have a positive future. And now I'll stop sharing my screen. You're still muted, Matt. Where's?
And I'll go back to sharing mine. Thank you. Look, before we've sort of come a bit to the end here, but before we do, and sort of take on a few questions, I'd really like to emphasise that with this coming together of groups, it's been very much based on a mutual understanding, mutual respect, and time. I can't emphasise enough, and I think that's been a problem with so many research projects in recent years, is that at times there has been enough time to develop the relationships that are so necessary. And I think Louise and Shelley will agree that these long-term projects like David Lindmeier's work out of ANU, and in bringing in someone like Damien Michael, really help engender that trust and that building that empathy that was really necessary to get some great outcomes when people like him were doing some research in recent years. Just throw to comments from Louise or Shelley on that one. Would you agree?
I think
absolutely.
Go on, I'll do Louise first.
Sorry.
Go.
Yep. Yeah. I think with this goes back to this principle of co-design. If a farmer is an an equal participant in the design of a program or a policy position, they'll have that long-term incentive to participate long after a program has ended. Now, in relation to monitoring, we know that monitoring can go forward beyond a program's life if the relationship's right, but also the commitment of the individual farmer to the outcomes and objectives of that program will go on long after the life of a program if that foundation principle of trust and equity in co-design is all built around that concept. And you know, in terms of researchers, I think you know, I've been aware of, you know, some species fish researchers we've had on our property, etc. And you know, just for the record too, we are predominantly a dryland farm. we have sheep and winter cereals, and we do have a small area of rice, which we're not sure how long we'll be able to do that. But it's interesting, biodiversity values on our actual small parcel of rice is higher than many other parts of our land, although we do have a lot of biodiversity because of our location and the number of trees we have on the property. But in terms of research, if you get sort of research from a government department coming in and wanting to do short-term research, and that might only be for a week or a day, etc., it's incredibly important that the department or the researcher comes back and actually reports back to you on what he or she finds, because I've certainly experienced it where, you know, you've let somebody onto the property and you may not ever hear of them again. And that's not really conducive to say, you know, well, do we do it again? Or we'd like to do it again, but that trust. And then I suppose the corresponding thing that we haven't discussed is government policy. How much of that acts as a disincentive compared to a co-designed program or policy that has reduced conflict, enhanced outcomes, and longer-term sustainable outcomes in meeting the program's objectives. So we haven't really discussed that disincentive versus incentive. Now, incentive doesn't have to be in the monetary term. It can be because the process was designed correctly, and therefore there is incentive because the person wants to be involved. That's a really important issue, I think, for future research.
Look, Shelley, how would you feel about that?
Yeah, look, sorry, I got distracted by reading Marta's comment there, so I blanked out there a little of that last bit. But the original question was about Damien Michael, and yeah, he was just a great example of a long-term relationship of research with the Hermestons, and he's been a significant contributor to NAPREC, and that's the key. It's the trust, and you need to invest in relationships to gain those trusts. And I think everyone's aware of that. It's not just a academia and farmer thing. It's for everyone in all their relationships. So we can't expect to have these miracle outcomes on, you know, there's been so many changes to our country in the short time that Europeans have been on this, you know, and not just Europeans now, but you know what I mean. There's been so many changes in a short space of time, and relationships are broken. And what I love about reconciliation ecology is it's not just about the ecology part, but it's reconciling the relationships between, you know, every group that uses the land and the vision that non-land users have for the land. If I'm kind of getting my point across, it's about relationships. Relationships take time, and it takes time to build trust.
And that leads me on very nicely to a comment from David Crew, who's with us this evening, talking about also the importance of including First Nations people in these discussions too. And I think we've seen, you know, not least of all in the last few years, how important that is in both water and fire. How there's so many opportunities there, I think, to increase, you know, collaboration with First Nations people, and also, you know, between the researchers, farmers, private landholders, and also public land managers too, in this, you know, this trying to deal with conserving biodiversity in a place where the biodiversity doesn't stand still. It travels around.
No.
And I think we've seen it with the bitterns, for example, in rice crops, where, you know, they're migrating all the way around Australia from these rice crops, and they're really starting, and they're finding them. Scientific research is finding them on the coast of Victoria and elsewhere around Australia now, as more radio tracking's been put on these birds. And that's really interesting stuff that's bringing together the social side of what we do on our land with also where nature is. I mean, it really shows the interconnection. Yes, please, Shelley.
Yep. And that's a fantastic project, because Matt Herring is just a wonderful person who invests in relationships and forming the relationships with the farmers that he works with. And that is the key to why the Bitterns in Rice project has been so successful, because there was trust with Matthew Herring. And, you know, I'm speaking in a biased, I guess, way, because I was quite heavily involved with the project and in its infancy. So I probably have a biased opinion there, but it's what made it work, because the trust was there.
I think too, sorry, in relationships, we need to bring it back to localism. I think it's really important. It doesn't matter whether it's Indigenous, whether it's farming sector, whether it's you know, there's a lot of local knowledge, and it's not necessarily harnessed to its full potential. No. So to do that, I think and with this concept of co-design, we can together deliver programs cheaper and more effectively for government and with government. But we have to be given that opportunity. You know, remote decision making might be convenient, but it's not necessarily the best process for getting those outcomes.
Look, really, really interesting concepts, really interesting discussions. I'm just keeping an eye on both time and also our chat room there. There's been quite a bit of chat coming through. Thanks to David. Thanks also to Marta, who is a CSU person who's also a vet. So great to see we've got some multidisciplinary people here this evening. Yeah. I'll just throw it open now. I think we have a small enough group. Yes, I'll just go. If you do want to go on to audio, and I think we've got enough bandwidth to be able to take audio this evening, or also into chat. And I've just got one question now come through from Sandy. Can you talk more on what the joint papers and joint research projects are about? I'm wondering how people can get involved in the formal collaborative group if they are wanting to. Look, I think I might be best placed to be able to speak about that one. The joint papers are actually looking at what we've actually been talking about this evening, and there have been some very neat case studies that have been put together by the authorship group, which included Shelley and Louise and myself, and we've brought together a few of these projects we've described tonight and a number of others as well, to describe how research projects have both gone well and not so well, and what we think could be done to improve them. That's the first part. The second part is looking at a more formal way of addressing this. And this is in our second paper, which we're just in the middle of writing right now, and which we hope to also publish soon as well, is where we could go in our collaborations and how we could, in some ways, more formalise these collaborations. This is something that we are approaching right now. We're also looking at, and again, we're in the middle of this because of the pandemic. We've sort of had to put it a little bit on the back burner, but we are just starting at the beginning of the pandemic to start to come together to look at possible joint projects. And so if there's anyone who's got a little bit of money around on the side there that needs spending, boy, have we got some projects for you, haven't we, Shelley and Louise?
Our hands are up.
Our hands are up. So, yes, so we are at that stage of where we're looking at how we could actually put this into practice now, looking at co-design and co-designing and co-managing, particularly for biodiversity control on farms. And I've had a question from Julie M. For you, Louise. Can you tell us about why you were comfortable and engaged in having fish ecologists on your farm? What was it about the approach and the framework that appealed to you? What helped you agree with that?
Well, we've actually had two types of fish research. One is directly with New South Wales Fisheries, and that was more of a brief encounter. And my comment about that is I'm happy to be involved in research, but I think follow-up information would be really good. And, government programs come and go, and it's, often difficulty. We've also been involved with some fish tagging with Dr. John Canallan, as he had some additional tags. So he was doing some research on the Edward Waugh Cool system west of Deniliquin. There was an opportunity to do some smaller research on the east of Deniliquin, and to look at the movement of fish between the Murray and the Edward system. I think, again, there's great opportunity if there was that trusting relationship, and that also, as I indicated with the, 20 years ago with the Plains Wanderer, when people come onto private land, there must, and the conditions for entry, given that there is often so little trust, we can't have information taken out of context or misused. So if we start on these good foundations where everyone's clear on what's going to be researched, how it's going to be used, and how it, can't be taken out of context, I think there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot, if you engage private landholder, not only can you get this public land research done, but then you can get the connectivity value with the private. But it won't happen if government policy settings or processes are disengaging. I see a lot of opportunity, but there has to be this mental change with designers of policy that, you know, focus on this co-design, not an imposed design.
Yes, and could also say too that importance of the face-to-face as well. And I know we're meeting this evening online, but I think that we can never underestimate that importance of face-to-face and actually meeting on someone's property or meeting on in a local cafe or something like that, as we have done with our research, and that coming together of people. Organisations seeing, I think, the importance of and recognising the importance of those workshops. I think as researchers, we recognise it, and I think farmers as a group recognise it, the importance of the incidental conversation over the back fence, the importance of the cup of coffee together and that sort of thing. That building of the personal relationships as well as professional relationships is so important in this building of trust and the building of relationships, so necessary. And building the, just building where we want to go with our research. Well, I've just had one question also here from Julie. One more question now, Dave. Could you make a comment on how information has been misused that you might have seen?
Well, it wasn't the case with the fisheries.
Yes.
It was I've made both the fisheries examples were positive. My only comment with one lot of fisheries, I didn't actually hear the research back, so that was my only comment there. But in relation to misuse, I have seen at a state level that when farmers may, in good faith, let people on their properties, information can be obtained and then end up having species listed as either threatened or vulnerable species. I mean, that happened with the Plains Wanderer example that I raised, but I've seen it elsewhere. I see the mechanisms is if we have good processes, good policy and good relationships, the focus should be on avoidance of species getting onto the threatened species list, because having species on the list doesn't actually mean that it's going to deliver outcomes on the ground. So the way to deliver outcomes on the ground is to design policy and processes and relationships that actually deliver those outcomes on the ground. Certainly in my experience, anyway.
Yeah. Shelley, anything that you want to add to that?
No, definitely concur. Yeah. With that. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I have had a question from David, and there is a request from him is if we could be so brave and bold as to open up this discussion about reconciliation ecology and the whole concept, I think, of private land. I'm not sure whether we've actually got enough time for this one now because we are coming towards the end, but about being the view of land being as custodians rather than of owners of land. And I'm not sure if you can see that question there.
No.
Does David want to expand on it? Maybe David can unmute
and expand on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, we might open that one up to David. So, David, if you could go on to, if you want to unmute yourself and just explain that a little bit, and then we can take it from there.
Just in everything that we've been involved with and understanding, growing and growing and growing, everything that I've been involved with is understanding the importance of country. And it's something that my wife has strongly promoted, is that everything people are doing, and especially around this region of Deniliquin, is on her country, her traditional lands. This is what has supported her people for thousands of years. All she asks is that people recognise that everybody is responsible for looking after her country and the people that live on her country. That is such a fundamental principle. And if we could all join in this process, we'll have a lot better community, understanding that their place is connected to the traditional owners of this land. It's not simply a title on a land or a fence or a recognition of this is my land and this is not. This is all Aboriginal country. And it only takes a little shift for all of us to move in that direction. We could have a much better society than we're living now. So that's my premise in this question.
Right. Does anyone want to take that one on?
I definitely see a future for NAPREC in addressing these issues as well, and I agree with David, we're all part of the solution. I think NAPREC is still so much in its infancy, and definitely, I suppose, reconciliation has such a different meaning in Australia than it does internationally. And when I first came across the word reconciliation, I probably saw ecology. I had it in the mindset of ecology, and that we can reconcile ecological outcomes and social outcomes on productive spaces, and then not really probably understanding fully the significance of the meaning of reconciliation in Australia. And certainly my time being involved with NAPREC, I've got to know Yakawa much more than what I did when the journey first started, and I've been fortunate enough to work with David through MRSG, and I know that I've learned a lot in that 5 years, and have a greater understanding and respect for traditional owners in that time. And I know it's something that we probably all need to work on a bit harder, and there's room for that to evolve. But as I said, I think NAPREC is still so in its infancy that it's baby steps, and the word reconciliation, I think that's going to evolve over time as well. And I know that's the best I can sort of answer that right now.
Louise, do you want to add any more to that?
Well, I think my point about localism, I think enhancing traditional knowledge and building relationships locally is important, and that I think we have, we often look as a society at broader groups and say, well, we're having consultation with this or that group or this or that stakeholder group, etc. But, if we come back to localism, then we can truly learn about our own region. We can value the knowledge in our own region, and that can be across all land types, land tenures, people, etc. There's so much opportunity, but unfortunately, through my journeys, I have seen a lot of challenges where localism and local knowledge and local people, are not always given the prominence or value in the broader sense, which is, you know, has been a disappointing process, I think, in many different facets.
Mm. Yeah, this process, we're only, as Shelley has said, we're only at the beginning. We really need to sort of presentation this evening is a great way of doing that, of getting more people involved, spreading the word, and trying to engage more groups and more people in this process. And David, we've talked about this in Deniliquin as well. We really hope and we really encourage that all groups in that localism, in that local region, will come together with us as we look to see how we can work together in research and broader in management as well. Go on, Louise.
Wes, this is where the relationship between educators is really important too, and researchers, because, you know, you can go down these journeys of, you know, programs, but particularly policy programs, and we go through cycles where we go through things that work, and then governments go through things that don't work, or they change policy directions, or they change funding programs, etc. And educators themselves, I think, have a really important role to play going forward, in that if there is increased understanding on the importance of people in developing and designing programs and policies, you know, things can be done a lot more effectively and cheaper for governments. And, you know, in this competitive world that we're going forward, post-COVID or post, you know, millennium drought, or post, you know, an economic decline, or, you know, competition internationally, every dollar is going to have to be, you know, fought over harder. And often, if we don't engage people in a more positive way, it's lost opportunity, and programs come and go, government policies come and go. And I think we're going to face, in the world of biodiversity, we're going to have to compete for health and other economic, you know, issues. So we've got to be smarter how we do things, and we've been following this single pathway of you know, we haven't always valued the lessons learnt, and so now is an opportunity to focus on this co-design concept. It's just a question of whether governments will see it that way, and I hope and trust that perhaps through the education systems, there's a more of an appreciation of advantages in such a concept. It's not a new concept. It's just that we go through these cyclical processes, and unfortunately, those cycles can have long-lasting ramifications.
Indeed. Look, we are going to have to wind up now. I think we've had some great discussion. I hope we've been able to show you also how social research can give a bit of a voice to different groups, sometimes groups who might not necessarily always be heard. I hope, David, that we've been able to address your question a bit as well this evening. And indeed invite groups around our regions and around Australia to join us in some of the issues that we've been looking at, and some of the ways of how we can address getting people more involved, and particularly from private landholders and lessees, how much we can involve more groups in working towards biodiversity conservation and natural resource management. Any last comments from yourself, Louise, and then Shelley, and then we might wind it up there.
I would just thank you for the audience for listening. It hasn't certainly in my time, I've seen the best and worst of public policy. And I think it's been a remarkable and interesting relationship with the researchers that I've got to know and academics, and I just welcome and are very appreciative of the chance to talk to you. And it's been a very, very good process from my point of view. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Louise. Shelley, any last comments from you?
Yeah. And I just want to a shout out to Jen and Michael who are on, because they've been really instrumental in the academic side of putting the paper together. And yeah, thanks for helping to the academia side to coming on board and sharing this process with us, because I really truly believe that, like David has just said, we can be leaders in this area, and it's just a hard slog where you get funding from to lead the way, but hopefully, yeah, we can really change the way policy is made and focus on outcomes rather than who's going to be the winner and who's going to be the loser. Let's both be winners. Not all of us, not both, everyone be winners. Yeah.
Exactly. And yes, I also would like to lend my support to that, to both my co-presenters this evening. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who has been with us this evening. I've noticed a number of friends, but also people from elsewhere as well. Thank you very much for listening. We will have this recording available. And so hopefully other people around Australia, around New South Wales, and indeed around our region too, will be able to hear just what wonderful people we have here working together on natural resource management, but also working together as people and showing the importance of people in all of this, and indeed social research and the ability to be able to find out what's happening with these groups and with these people. Thank you very much again. Good evening, and really great to be with you here tonight.
Good evening to all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you later. And thanks very much also to Institute for Land, Water and Society for hosting as well. Thank you, Charles Sturt University. Well done.
Thank you.
Well done.